Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. If you're a leader, a recruiter, or an HR professional, you're really going to want to lean in for this one. Today, we're adopting a totally constructive, non-judgmental lens to explore what is honestly a massive blind spot in modern recruitment. We spend so much time optimizing our talent pipelines and talking about diversity, right? But there's this invisible barrier that's quietly filtering out some of the most incredibly resilient, capable people from our workforces. We're talking about the workplace stigma surrounding addiction and recovery. My goal today is to guide you through the mechanics of this bias. We're going to rethink our internal cultural narratives, and ultimately, we're going to learn how to hire better.
I want you to really imagine something for a second. Imagine walking into a job interview where the interviewer has already decided you're unreliable, dishonest, and dangerous, literally before you've even spoken a single word. Let's just flip our perspective and build some empathy for what stigmatized candidates face every single day. For most folks in recovery, this isn't just a hypothetical fear. It's their baseline reality. The stigma acts as the absolute most destructive obstacle between a person's recovery and their employment. It is such a heavy burden to carry into a room. And as hiring managers, we have to acknowledge that this invisible dynamic is sitting right across the desk from us.
All right, let's dive into part one, the anatomy of the barrier. We need to re-anchor ourselves in the actual science.
To actually fix this barrier, we've got to tear down this super outdated idea that addiction is some sort of character flaw. Modern medicine strictly defines it as a neurobiological disorder. It fundamentally alters brain chemistry. Think of it like managing a chronic medical condition, like diabetes or hypertension, right? It requires daily management and lifestyle adjustments, not just some sudden burst of virtue. Yet, because a lot of people lack this medical framework, that outdated moral residue just keeps fueling workplace stigma and fear. And fear in the hiring process? Well, that inevitably leads to prejudice.
And this creates a massive gap between the prejudiced emotional response and reality. Society's stereotype tells us that a person in recovery is a risk factor, which immediately generates this emotional response of fear, or sometimes even contempt. But the reality? You are actually looking at a highly courageous person who has actively done the hard work to rebuild their life and manage a really complex medical condition. Recognizing that difference is absolutely step one for any inclusive leader. Moving right along to part two. The mechanics of bias. Let's look at how our HR systems actually fail here.
Because stigma doesn't just, float around in the ether. It literally infects the nuts and bolts of our hiring systems. These four components work together to create an invisible, deeply pervasive barrier. It starts with stereotypes, those broad societal beliefs. That fuels prejudice, the negative emotional response we were just talking about. And that leads directly to discrimination. Think about not calling a candidate back just because you saw a gap in their CV. But the final piece, identity shift, that's where the candidate actually internalizes the rejection. They start to believe they're completely unemployable. These four forces create a loop that just sustains itself.
But here's the kicker. Before a human being even has the chance to discriminate, our tech tools are often doing the dirty work for us. We have to recognize that automated screening systems, the ones flagging employment gaps or background checks, they're acting as algorithmic enforcers of stigma. They categorically reject talent before a human ever even lays eyes on the application. We are literally losing qualified people who never get to the interview stage to show us their actual competence, all because a proxy for stigma screened them out.
Now, for the folks who do manage to land on our desks, something called narrative interpretation takes over. When you're reviewing an employment gap, a generous lens assumes the candidate was, traveling or planning their next big career move. But a stigma lens, that assumes they're unreliable or bouncing in and out of jobs. So here's a really concrete tip for recruiters. Standardize exactly how you view gaps. Treat a gap for health recovery exactly the same as you would treat a gap for higher education or parental leave. Don't invent a negative story to fill in an objective blank space on a resume.
We also have to be super careful about a specific cognitive bias during interviews, the reverse halo effect. Now, you probably know the traditional halo effect. That's when one good trait makes us view literally everything about a person positively. Well, here, the exact reverse happens. A candidate might have amazing qualifications and completely stellar references, but the single knowledge of an addiction history completely overshadows all of those positive attributes. The stigma just dominates our entire perception.
Which brings us to part three, the human cost, and the psychological weight this places on the candidate.
Beyond the systems and the biases, we really need to understand the heavy psychological toll this takes on the human being sitting across the desk from you. It creates what we call an interview anxiety loop,
A candidate who anticipates stigma comes into the interview completely hypervigilant. This creates massively heightened anxiety. They aren't even focused on answering your questions well, they're too busy monitoring your face for any sign of judgment. And that anxiety, it totally undermines their performance. They might seem less articulate or overly nervous. Unfortunately, the interviewer often misinterprets that anxiety as incompetence or unreliability, which falsely confirms the stereotype. They aren't unqualified, they are just surviving anticipated stigma.
And honestly, the damage usually starts before they even hit apply. When candidates face continuous rejection, they internalize it. They suffer from self-stigma. They start thinking, maybe I don't deserve good work, or I'm fundamentally flawed. This drastically reduced self-efficacy causes them to just self-select out. They see your job posting, they know for a fact they are qualified, but they don't apply because they believe society's negative narrative about them.
The stakes here? They are incredibly high. It is absolutely vital to understand that the sheer emotional pain of continuous workplace rejection, the shame, and the hopelessness, these are significant triggers for relapse. When seeking employment becomes too painful, the barriers to employment actually become indirect barriers to a person's recovery itself. By fixing our hiring processes, we aren't just filling open roles, we are actively supporting the health of our entire community.
All right, part 4, the breakthrough. Let's talk about inclusive recruitment and actual business value.
So how do we actually manually override these system flaws? How do we unlock this highly motivated talent pool? We have to shift from automatic, categorical rejection to contextual reviews. This means looking at the applicant's journey holistically. To do this, you need to equip your hiring teams with a checklist of behavioral questions that assess resilience without triggering shame. Instead of pointing and asking, hey, why is there a gap here? Try asking, tell me about a time you had to overcome a significant personal or professional obstacle. Or describe a period where you had to adapt to a major change. What strategies did you use to stay focused? These questions openly invite the candidate to share their strengths rather than forcing them to defend their past.
Listen to how a candidate might expertly reframe their history. They might say, I faced a health challenge that required my complete focus. I've since recovered, developed significant resilience, and am now focused on contributing meaningfully. When you hear an answer like this in an interview, you have to recognize it for what it is. A candidate framing their recovery as overcoming a medical health challenge is demonstrating immense resilience and self-awareness. Instead of seeing this as a red flag, inclusive leaders should see this as a huge, bright green light. It indicates a candidate who knows exactly how to overcome severe adversity.
Ultimately, if you need a business case for this, it comes down to empirical ROI. The research actually shows that people in recovery represent lower-risk employees than the general population. Because they have fought so incredibly hard to rebuild their lives, they are highly motivated, intensely grateful for the opportunity, and significantly less likely to leave. That gives you incredible loyalty. They bring a proven, tested resilience to your teams that you simply cannot train into someone.
So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. I want you to go look at your ATS today. Look at your standard interview questions. Are your systems quietly filtering out the most resilient, loyal talent available to you right now? It is time to break the invisible barrier. By shifting our perspective and updating our policies, we can absolutely turn a historical blind spot into our absolute greatest hiring advantage. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and happy hiring.